Hey, this is Collin Moshman for CardRunners.com. Today's quickie is going to be on the Nash range fold call ranges for different situations. Now, this is something that I'm very big on in today's games because a huge focus has become small raises, 3-bet shoves, and defending against 3-bet shoves once you've raised. So we're going to vary a little bit the number of players left, the effective stack, positions, and the 3-bet shove ranges themselves. And this last one is going to give us exploitive results. So many opponents are not going to be 3-bet shoving like they should, and against those opponents, we should modify our open and call ranges. So let's begin by looking at 9 players left in a 9-man, and everyone has the same 1500 stack. So when we're in the button, our opening range is going to be around the top 32%. Now, the first point that people often have questions on is why is the range constructed like it is? So in other words, we're opening ace X, we're opening jack 8 offsuit, but we're not opening pocket 3s and pocket 4s. And the reason for that is because we're assuming that the blinds, or any remaining player left to act in general, is never going to flat. And so against players who do flat, we're often going to want playability. But we don't particularly need post-flop playability in these hands. What we want to open are either hands that are going to have the equity to call against 3-bet shove ranges, or failing that, blockers. And pocket pairs too low to call it off with are not going to have those. So, for instance, with pocket 3s, we're not going to have the equity to call it off, and at the same time, we don't block any of the hands, or possibly ace-3 suited, but not many hands in our opponent's 3-bet shove ranges, and so those hands are not going to be as valuable in this analysis. So based on that, we open 32%. The blinds 3-bet 20 and 27% respectively, and of course the reason the big blind can 3-bet wider is because the small blind has to worry to some extent about the big blind waking up with a strong hand, which is going to tighten his 3-bet shoving range. Now we can pull up the calling range once one of the blinds shoves. So let's imagine the big blind shoves, and before we pull up our calling range against that, go ahead and think for a moment about this situation, and if this happened in-game, what hands you would call him with. So the actual calling range here is going to be top 13%. So 5s, ace-7 suited, ace-9 off, king-10 suited, king-queen off. So a fairly wide range. Now, of course, that's going to be a function of our opponent's 3-bet shove range. So we're assuming that the big blind is shoving quite wide. He's shoving a lot of these semi-bluffing hands. He's shoving any pocket pair, hands like jack-10 offsuit. So we can go ahead and we can modify that. So let's say we edit his range and we say, well, let's say, because typically if an opponent is deviating from these 3-bet shove ranges, it's going to be in the tighter direction. There will, of course, be exceptions with maniacs and other very loose aggressive players, but generally, players, if anything, are going to be shoving tighter. So let's say, if anything, we think that he's shoving tighter and we give him a range of top 17%. So what that's going to allow us to do is to raise more hands and then defend narrower to exploit his overly tight 3-bet shove range. So we can pull that up quantitatively and have the Hold'em resources downloadable give us what our new calling range should be. So let's go ahead and pull that up. And we see that even with the small blind actually 3-bet shoving wider as a result of the fact that we can now open more hands, we still open quite a bit wider. Okay, so we can now open pocket 4s, which are going to be for hands like 10-7 offsuit, and we're also going to have to call tighter against him because of the fact that he's 3-bet shoving considerably more narrow than the Nash range. So we can pull that up and we see now we only call him with 5s, ace-10 suited, and ace-jack offsuit. So against many more passive players, this is going to be the type of calling range that we want to go back to. Now, as our position gets earlier and earlier, we expect that a couple of things are going to happen to these ranges. The first one is that we're going to have to open tighter, and the next is that the remaining players to act are all going to 3-bet shove tighter. So we can move, for instance, to the hijack MP3, and here we're only going to open top 20%. Again, we might think if we're opening a hand like Queen-10 offsuit, we're also going to open 6s. But if we assume that our opponents are playing a strictly 3-better fold game, pocket pairs that we're not going to be able to call it off with go down substantially in value, and so we're not going to open those.